All right, welcome to our explainer. Today we're diving deep into a really critical assessment by Arvind Panagarya of India's economic path right after independence. And we're going to focus in on that foundational and, let's face it, controversial Nehruvian era.
So, the big question we're tackling is this. How did the vision of just one man end up shaping the economy of a massive nation for decades to come? We're going to unpack the ideas, the policies, and the legacy of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and see how those decisions from way back then still echo in India's economy today.
Okay, here's our game plan. We're going to break this down into 4 key parts. First, we'll get into the architect's mindset. Then, we'll look at how the economic model was actually built. After that, we'll assess the legacy, the impact on growth and poverty. And finally, we'll jump into the debate that's still raging today.
Right. First things first, let's try and get inside the mind of the man himself. Because if you really want to understand the policies, you've got to understand the why behind them, the core beliefs that were driving Nehru's whole economic philosophy.
This quote right here, this is the absolute key. Panagarya argues that for Nehru, capitalism wasn't just some abstract economic system. No, he believed it was the very engine that powered imperialism. This conviction, this single idea, became the bedrock for his entire economic vision for a free India.
Now, here's a term you absolutely have to know for your exams. Nehru was not some kind of revolutionary communist. He was what's known as a Fabian socialist. What does that mean? It means he believed in reaching a socialist society, but not through some violent revolution. Instead, he advocated for a slow, gradual, and democratic transition. It's a really crucial distinction.
Of course, big ideas need an architect to make them real. And for Nehru, that person was the brilliant statistician P.C. Mahalnobis. He was the guy who took Nehru's broad vision and translated it into a formal, mathematical economic model, a model that was all about self-sufficiency and state-owned heavy industry. And this wasn't just theory. It became the actual blueprint for the incredibly important Second Five-Year Plan back in 1956.
But, and this is really important to remember, his wasn't the only voice in the room. There was a small but pretty influential group of thinkers who were arguing for a totally different path, one based on free enterprise, where the government steps back and lets business drive the economy.
And these were the key figures leading that charge. For those of you studying for exams, here's a quick mnemonic to help you remember these names. Just think, my small shop runs freely. The first letters, MSSR, stand for Masani, Shenoy, Shroff, and Rajagopalachari. And the phrase itself perfectly captures their core belief. These thinkers would eventually go on to form the Swatantra Party to formally challenge Nehru's model. Okay, so we've got the competing ideas on the table. Now for our second section, let's see how this all moved from theory and debate into actual, concrete policies, the frameworks that would run India's economy for decades. This timeline shows a really clear trend, doesn't it? It's basically a steady march toward more and more state control. It started back in 1945. Then in 48, it shifted to a more Keynesian approach, where the government spends to manage the economy. But then in 1956, there was a sharp pivot towards a much more top-down Soviet-style system of central planning.
And this brings us to a term you have got to know, the license Raj. What's so fascinating, and a detail Panagarya really highlights, is that its roots actually predate independence. The whole idea of using government licenses to control every aspect of industry was first floated in a 1945 policy statement when the British were still in charge.
So why that dramatic shift in 1956? Panagarya connects this huge pivot toward a more rigid, Soviet-inspired model directly to a political event, the death of Sardar Patel. With Patel gone, Nehru's power was consolidated, and he basically had a free hand to push his economic vision through without any major opposition.
And then, boom, an external shock hits that basically cements this whole inward-looking approach. In 1957, a balance of payments crisis sparked this deep fear of running out of foreign currency. This led directly to super restrictive import policies that, for all practical purposes, sealed India off from the global economy for years and years.
Okay, so we've got the ideology and the policies, but what was the result of all this? What did this complex economic machine actually produce? Let's dig into the numbers and unpack Panagarya's core conclusion about the legacy of this era.
So what's the headline number? It's this, 4%. That was the average annual economic growth during the Nehru years. And on the surface, you might think, hey, for a brand new nation, that's not terrible. But that number alone really doesn't tell the whole story. Here's the problem. While the economy was growing at 4%, the population was growing at 2%. So if you do the math, the growth per person was only about 2% a year. And Panagaria's argument is that this rate was just way too slow to make any kind of real, meaningful dent in the massive poverty plaguing the country.
And this all leads us to Panagaria's very stark, very central argument. He basically concludes that Nehru the politician was a massive success. He built a stable, unified, democratic India against all odds. But Nehru the economist? On that front, he argues, the project was an unqualified failure.
But is it really that simple? Can you lay decades of economic performance at the feet of just one person? Well, the book's reviewer pushes back on this idea, and that opens up a really crucial debate about how we should view this history.
So let's just break this debate down. Panagaria's view is crystal clear. Nehru is the one who's responsible for setting India on the wrong economic track. The reviewer, on the other hand, says, hold on, that's a bit too simple, and argues that it's a misreading of a very complicated period of history.
The counter-argument really boils down to 3 key points. First, Nehru was a product of his time. I mean, look around at other newly independent countries back then. Leaders from Mao to Nasser were all choosing similar state-led, self-sufficient paths. Second, his successors, especially his daughter Indira Gandhi, didn't just stick with his policies, they doubled down, pushing India even further to the left. And third, is it really fair to blame Nehru for the fact that later leaders failed to reform the system even when its flaws became obvious?
And this brings us to another key concept, the idea that India, for a long time, remained a deeply statist economy. That just means an economy where the state, not the private market, is seen as the main driver. The reviewer's final point is that this mindset lived on long after Nehru, suggesting that the responsibility for India's economic path is actually shared.
All right, for everyone preparing for exams, this slide is gold. This is your high-level summary. We've got the key people, Nehru, the Fabian socialist, and his chief planner, Mahalnobis. The key concepts, the license Raj, born in 1945, and the idea of a statist economy. We have the key policies and the key data. That 4% growth wasn't enough. And of course, the central debate was Nehru solely to blame. I would seriously recommend pausing here and taking a screenshot or just jotting these points down.
And all this leaves us with one last, pretty provocative question to chew on. If Nehru was the one who set the path, why has India, for decades after him, found it so incredibly difficult to forge a new one? What does it say about a country's political and economic culture when these foundational ideas prove to be so incredibly sticky? That's a question worth pondering.